Hello, everyone. This is Eva Nolik-Smith with YogaUOnline, and I'm here today with author and yoga therapist Doug Keller. Most of you already know Doug for his very detailed, in-depth knowledge about the anatomy of yoga alignment, in particular as it applies to the structural health of the body. Doug is the author of several books on yoga, including the two-part book Yoga as Therapy, which is an impressive detailed description of all the structural aspects of yoga practice and the applications of yoga as therapy. Doug's yoga background includes 7 years of studying yoga in India, as well as intensive training in Iyengar yoga and Anusara yoga, although he has since developed his own system of teaching. He travels extensively, offering yoga workshops both in the US and internationally, and we are very pleased to have caught up with him today, just as I believe you are on your way out the door to Europe.
Off to Europe, yes.
Yes. So welcome, Doug. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us
Thank
today.
you. Glad to be here in person.
Yeah, it's great. It's a good experiment here. Nice to actually see you on Skype for a change. So we're here to talk about backbends, and we might say that of all the different groups of yoga postures, all the different groups are important, but backbends are perhaps even more so, because when we do backbends in yoga, it's one of the few times we really stretch the spine in full extension, full backbend. And so could you tell us about backbends and why they're so important and what their benefits are?
Well, definitely useful to do. What we did in the last webinar that we did was cover forward bends and the role of forward bending, pointing out that forward bending is what we spend most of our time doing, so much so that the body worker Eric Dalton said we have a flexion addiction. It's like we're all the time bending forward, and that's where a lot of our health problems come from. So back bendings provide an important corrective to that, strengthening the spine to hold us upright, the neck to keep the neck healthy, working all the muscles at the back body that keep the spine, as I said, upright and healthy. And there are degrees of back bending and also different orientations of back bending. You have the camel pose where you're upright. You have back bending when you're lying on your stomach, when you're lying on your back. All of those have a different effect upon the spine as well as the hips and the shoulders, and all of those have a benefit. When people think of back bending, they usually think of the deep back bends that they see on magazine covers and in videos and that sort of thing. And that has its place in yoga, but I think the really essential benefits of back bending come from the simple back bends that really anybody can and to some degree, given their health condition, should do with proper modifications. Again, because it keeps the spine healthy. So it's really a counterpose to the rest of our life, which is very important. Um, and certainly it can be overdone, but it's not to be underdone because it's something very necessary to do. And it's essential part of our practice for sure.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit more in depth about why it matters. I mean, it's obvious that, with computer use, with texting, with a sedentary lifestyle, we do spend most of our time with the spine hunched forward. But why does it matter? It may not be like the prettiest of postures, but why really care?
Well, to give an example, I mean, even yesterday I was out with my wife and in-laws, and my mother-in-law was telling me about yet another person who's a friend of hers who has spinal stenosis and is considering surgery for this, and then she's getting the same sort of symptoms of numbness. So she was concerned about whether she needs surgery and so on and so forth. And it seems spinal stenosis is almost considered a natural part of aging, as well as a lot of the other back problems that are so much a part of our culture. And the body is designed to protect against that condition. There are muscles along the spine that are meant to fine tune the actions of the vertebrae and discs and nerves to prevent that condition from developing. Those muscles don't stay energized enough by the kinds of things that we do, like you say, sitting in chairs sitting, slumping, hunching over, and they're energized and awakened by simple actions of backbending, even the smallest ones. Even people that practice chair yoga can practice a kind of backbend in a chair. And of course, we get a much more stronger version of it in a regular yoga class. And so it's not simply strengthening the muscles that cause movement of the body, but strengthening those deeper postural muscles that basically, once again, fine tune the body and keep it functioning properly. And it's necessary to do that. These muscles don't necessarily need a lot of hard work. It's more repeated actions with not much load upon them is enough to keep them healthy. So simple movements are an important part of practice, even though, again, they're not necessarily the prettiest movements or the most impressive movements. They're even more important to do just for the value that they offer. And we'll certainly won't be looking simply at simple movements like that, but particularly backbending that we do in a general yoga class or what we're used to doing in class.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And as important as they are, backbends are not really necessarily easy poses. I mean, even the simple backbends may be easy to get into, but most people have a lot of alignment issues and a lot of actions that are missing to really perform the pose with the most benefit and also most comfort.
There are certainly limitations that come in, and one of the biggest limitations is tightness in the shoulders and the neck, as well as tightness in the thighs and the hip flexors, again, just from sitting for such long periods of time. And so, or the other things that we do during our life, even sports and activities. So, some time has to be given to warming up these muscles because otherwise, if we don't, we tend to bend too much in one part of the spine. And exactly where that place is differs between people. But regardless of the differences between them, between people, we certainly want the stretch to the spine and the extension to be more even through the spine, more like a bridge. And so we need to have the different warm ups and the kind of awareness that allows us to get that nice, even symmetrical bend to the spine that keeps it more healthy. And so it's manageable, but there has to be the certain right amount of warm up to the body. Um, there also has to be the different kinds of openings that allow it to happen and a basic sense of awareness of the body so you get a nice, comfortable stretch to the spine without putting too much stress on any one particular point. And the challenge in teaching is we try to give instructions that are simple enough for people to follow without everything grinding to a halt as you stop to explain. And at the same time, in the attempt to be simple in our language, we tend to oversimplify and overgeneralize to the point where sometimes the instructions for some people hardly even make sense or they don't quite know what we're getting at. So the challenge is always to find simple language that people can take in and use and feel in their own body. So we're certainly going to be looking at the different concepts and instructions and language that has been used in backbending and how we might refine that language a little bit better to make it more clear, accurate, and also a lot more accessible to people.
Yeah, because I think one of the things yoga teachers most often experience is that people complain of pain in the low back or discomfort in the low back with back bends.
Yeah, and certainly the kind of back bend that you do affects that. When somebody does an upright back bend like Ustrasana, it dumps a lot of weight into the lower back, which is very uncomfortable. And for that reason, most people don't like Ustrasana. And there are ways to do it, and it's more a challenge of overcoming people's habits as they do a back bend in order for them to do it effectively. Again, it's not necessarily that they're doing it wrong per se, they're just importing some bad habits into the back bend that's very hard to break. By the same token, a pose like cobra pose or upward facing dog pose, people can often push too much into their lower back by using their arms too much or hyperextending their neck as they do that. So again, these are all habits and sometimes the result of ambitions where people push themselves too hard into the pose and then wonder why it hurts. And often the first response is, well, maybe if you do it a little bit less, it wouldn't hurt so much. It's like back off some and pay attention to what you're doing and see if we can get a more satisfying experience out of this.
Yeah, yeah. So, one of the frustrating things about backbends is that, at least from the student's perspective, it's very hard, or it's a very slow process to improve your range of motion and make progress in backbends and extension poses. So, example from my own life, my flexion range of motion has increased tremendously. Probably 4 to 8 inches in forward bend, because my hamstrings are these like nice little elastic to just keep lengthening. But progress in backbends is just slow, 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 because there's so many moving parts involved.
Yeah, also the body has a built-in resistance to backbending, which is actually a form of protection. Many of the ligaments, especially the ligament along the front of the spine, is much stronger than the ligaments that resist forward bending. And that ligament is a good thing. It protects the spine, and we don't want to stretch it overly or too much. And so it's a progressive process of getting the rest of the body to move in coordination with those ligaments, so we don't stress the ligaments too much, increase our range of motion, and increase our ability to hold, once again, a more upright position. And so it's sometimes our problem is our concept of progress, like where we're meant to go. I mean, we don't walk around in a full back bend. We do a back bend so that we can walk around in a healthy way. We don't maintain the back bend. We maintain the benefits of the back bend. And so there's a limit to how much stretching you want to do to the ligaments which resist back bending, but at the same time you want to strengthen the muscles that allow you to work with that stretching, because they're the ones that benefit you once you're done with your yoga practice and go to sit for meditation or get up and go on with your life. And so the progress is felt in how well you function in normal life, not necessarily how far you go in the yoga class. And it's often the people that are very flexible or hyper flexible that really excel at backbends in class. They're the ones who actually suffer in normal life because of some of the stability in the body that they lost from doing that practice. So we want to emphasize backbending in a way that increases stability while increasing mobility for some people, and teaching other people maybe to back off a little bit when they have too much mobility. So it's a fine line where the purpose is always to make life better and not to worry about exactly what kind of progress we make in the class per se. And then again, that's the challenge of what we're trying to communicate to students, so that they benefit from from the practice well. But yes, there are roadblocks built in that make backbending much more challenging for some people than others. By the same token, that doesn't make backbending any less beneficial to the people that are less flexible than others. And in many cases, backbending is more beneficial to the inflexible people than it is to the flexible people, who sometimes suffer some degree of harm or pain from overdoing the backbending. So it's a fine balance to strike.
Yeah, yeah. And I think also as teachers, we tend to think about backbends as involving the spine, but really there's many different parts of the body involved. And you touched on that a little bit already, but could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, we're certainly working with extension of the spine, but we're working really with the muscles that control not just the extension of the spine, but also the extension of the hips, as well as the opening of the shoulders, and also maintaining a healthy neck. So the focus is on the movement of the spine, but the real benefit comes from what's happening all the way around it, which is really important to understand.
Yeah. So you're talking hip flexors and shoulder opening,
Yeah.
just the pec majors, or the whole shoulder girdle
Yeah,
is.
pectoralis, especially pectoralis minor, which just about everybody is at least a little bit tight on, how it affects the neck. We'll be touching upon the psoas muscle as well. And backbending is usually treated as a stretch, or better, a release for the psoas. But the way in which it's done in many variations, especially again in the case of flexible people, doesn't really efficiently get at the psoas. It stretches the psoas tendons and the front of the hip joint, but doesn't really benefit the psoas from the kind of back bending that they're doing to release it. A back bend certainly lengthens the psoas, which reduces pressure on the low back, helps to reduce pain in the low back that comes from a tight psoas and quadratus and things around it. Uh, but a healthy back bend, again, a symmetrical one, really does address the psoas well. It's just we get a little bit too ambitious in trying to stretch it when it's not really the kind of muscle that you stretch. So both through the hip flexors, the psoas, tensor fasciae lata we'll talk about, and the other muscles involved, the adductors in there, all of which are involved in a lot of the common instructions that people give in teaching a yoga class. We can look in simple language at addressing these muscles a little bit more beneficially, as well as the upper body. It's a big bite to take off to try to deal with the hips and the shoulders and the neck all in one session talking or one lesson talking about back bending. But we'll simplify it by taking as the focus what are the most common instructions used and how can we look at those instructions more beneficially. And we can kind of look under the hood to see what muscles are being addressed by this without necessarily going on a long disquisition about the psoas and other things. But we can really touch upon what makes the practice beneficial when we understand the instructions well, or even modify how the instructions are done to some degree. And I find there's a lot of back and forth argument within the yoga community about what instruction to use, like tuck the tailbone, don't tuck the tailbone, so on and so forth. And the conversation doesn't move forward very well because nobody really gets down to, first of all, talk about exactly what is that instruction communicating, how are students hearing it, and what are the students actually doing when they hear that instruction, regardless of what you think you're saying. The real question in teaching is what are the students actually doing, and how do you recognize what they're doing? Ultimately, what's the purpose of the instruction in the first place? What part of the body are you talking to, and what part of a person's awareness are you awakening with the instruction? Because yoga is as much about speaking to the awareness of the person doing the yoga as it is isolating or targeting a certain muscle for a stretch or release or strengthening. What we often leave out is the whole awareness of consciousness, and yoga is all about consciousness, not just about muscles. Muscles are just a form of consciousness, really.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned that discussion as an example, and it's very fascinating because I've noticed whenever that discussion comes up, also within the community of yoga teachers, people understand that instruction differently. So the non-talkers tend to understand the instruction as a posterior tilt of the pelvis, whereas the lengthen your tailbone crowd tend to understand it more as an action that doesn't involve an actual tilting or movement of the pelvis. And even sort of that common difference doesn't always, as a starting point for the discussion, that is not discussed. And it's obvious that when there's that confusion within the community of yoga teachers, then yes, students are going to understand that instruction in many different ways. And I've seen in our classes, when you say lengthen your tailbone, some people do tilt their pelvis posteriorly, which of course is what you don't want. And the other piece of that very interesting discussion is that I think it originated to a degree in Osara Yoga, where you had the inner spiral and the outer spiral, but they were always two actions that were linked. So the inner spiral would tend to stick your tail, your butt out a little bit, and you counteracted that by lengthening the tailbone, and you get this really great core engagement. But somehow that got lost on.
Yeah, it came to be a lot. As often happens, one aspect of the thing started to get more emphasized than the other, where everybody was talking about inner spiral, and then the whole other part was just kind of tagged on at the end as like, yes, after that, outer spiral, and it left people confused. Um, and again, the overall effect of the language, because you're speaking, I mean, a muscle can react in the body in different ways depending upon how you talk to it, and also body parts react in different ways in terms of how you talk to it. When we talk about actions of the tailbone, you're talking to muscles around the tailbone that perform a certain action that are not necessarily achieving what you're intending. You want the effect of a feeling of lengthening through the tailbone, that with the movements of the sacrum, nutation, counter nutation, support, and even extension to the spine. But the effect of talking about the tailbone too much is people use the muscles around the tailbone and tighten the pelvic floor in a way that actually limits mobility and puts pressure upon other parts of the body. And overall, I think we run into the problem of, first of all, in instructions, sometimes the whole pelvis is treated as one big unit when it's actually three moving parts that in important ways move independently of each other. The sacrum moves independently of the pelvic bones. And depending upon the pose that you do, something asymmetrical like Warrior One pose, the two pelvic bones move somewhat independently of each other, doing something a little bit different. One side, the hip is flexing, the other side, it's extending, and the sacrum is negotiating the difference between the two. And so if we always just talk, even in, for instance, Warrior One, about just tucking the pelvis, then you're telling the two pelvic bones to do the same thing and the sacrum to do the same thing along with it, which is not what actually is happening in the pose. And even if you do make distinctions, still the student often thinks of the pelvis as just one big unit. And so regardless of what you say, the student thinks, well, I'll just tuck my pelvis. And so a kind of precision in instruction that allow people to have points of awareness, like what are the hip points doing? What are you feeling in the lower belly? And then often you can feel the action of the tailbone as a result of other actions, where it kind of slides into the place in the way that it's meant to, rather than speaking directly to the tailbone and say, do this with your tailbone, and have people just essentially tighten up the pelvic floor as a result. So again, it's a fine line of language that's both accurate but also speaks to the person accurately so they can understand and really feel what's going on in the body. So the NSR principles were another attempt to simplify things down, but often it didn't. In the beginning, it didn't make distinctions between the different kinds of actions going on depending upon the pose that you were doing. And once you did get into a pose which is asymmetrical, like a Warrior One pose, where the two legs are doing two different things, then when you started to explain yourself a little bit more deeply, because the principles could accommodate that, then all of a sudden it started to get complicated again. You're saying this leg's doing inner spiral, that's leg's doing outer spiral. And then, of course, the student gets a little bit confused too. So you need to take a step back to basic markers that they could follow to feel what's going on, and also recognize and acknowledge the differences between the poses and the different things that you're trying to accomplish in these poses. Because that one pose is a little bit of a forward bend and a little bit of a back bend at the same time, for instance, even as downward facing dog pose is.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and we have such limited vocabulary for the different kinds of contraction and stretching that we can do. Different kind of actions with the muscles. I mean, we have isometric contraction and eccentric contraction, and I think there's one more.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
most people they don't know those terms, and even those terms are somewhat limited in terms of the sophistication of what's happening in the yoga pose when you apply all the actions of the muscles that are possible.
yeah, and their inner vocabulary is often equally limited, like the whole discussion about the role that the gluteal muscles play in doing a back bend. Again, this is another endless discussion about whether you should tighten the gluteals or not tighten the gluteals. Should they be hard or soft? Which again is really very limited vocabulary because, of course, if you tighten your gluteal muscle isometrically, like really squeeze it, make it hard and tight, then try to do a back bend, you won't be able to, because an isometric contraction both doesn't move the bones and is designed not to allow the bones to move. I mean, rather than tight or not tight, it's simple enough to point out that when you're doing a back bend, you use your gluteals. So why not use your gluteals? And it's a question of how are you using your gluteals, which is the different question from saying, are you tightening your butt or not tightening your butt? Because both words don't really serve what's going on. And so to do any pose, we use our muscles to do a pose. And certainly we're aware of what muscles may get in the way of doing a pose. But the gluteals don't get in the way of doing a back bend because they're hip extensors. They have an important role to play both for protecting the body and for moving the body. So yeah, introducing students to a little bit more refined vocabulary, which at the same time is more user friendly, would be really helpful. Because otherwise, it's just an endless discussion about to tighten or not to tighten, or even this concept that what you do with the muscle is to tighten it, like you were some kind of weightlifter showing off your muscles. Obviously, that doesn't serve movement. And a big part of yoga practice is movement and how to move well and how to teach the body to move well.
Right, right, yeah. So yeah, you already sort of danced around all the different things you will be covering in your course on Backbends on YogaU, but tell us a little more specific. Are you going to go into depth with these kind of alignment instructions, what they tend to mean, and what you could say to make it a little more clear for the student what actually to do?
I think the center of it will be, once again, in the beginning, to talk about really what the essential benefit of doing backbending is, and what kind of benefits or what kind of backbends can benefit us most, both in a basic practice as well as the role that they play in what we'd call a more advanced practice, or a practice where you go a little bit deeper into extension. And then from there, start to look at what are the basic instructions that are most often given, or in some cases, the most controversial in teaching or doing backbends. Look at what's the intention of the instruction, what's the anatomy behind it, what can be the pitfalls to that instruction, and how it might be said better in a way that is still user friendly in an ordinary yoga class. What can teachers use without getting horribly complex and explaining things? It's important for people listening to the webinar to have the explanation, so that if you're a teacher and a student comes up and says, I like that instruction, it worked for me, so exactly what was happening there, you can give a little bit more background to what you're saying and why you were saying it. Um, but to take another look and perhaps hopefully resolve some of the discussions going around with these instructions, because I always say about instructions, they're not necessarily bad instructions, they're just not always good enough, and we can always be improving our language. And from that, we'll also look at the different types of backbends in terms of the orientation of the body, like the difference between a backbend that you do on your stomach, that you do standing up or on your knees, like Ustrasana, and then a backbend that you do on your back, like the bridge pose, like the wheel pose. What are the dynamics of each kind of backbend, and how is that affecting the body differently? Especially taking into account people's most common complaints, which are often complaints that there's too much load on their lower back is pinching, or feels compressed, or doesn't feel happy after class. We can certainly look at what are good releases for doing those poses, but also how the poses themselves might be done better. First of all, to break the unconscious habits that people are bringing into the pose, and how to recruit the body better so that the body not only feels better, but learns something from having done it.
That's great. And the overall picture, you touched in the beginning on how backbends can help counteract many of these age-related issues that we tend to think is just kind of the natural progression of aging. Um, is that the general principle of moving the spine that will help create keep that fluidity in the spine that can?
I think fluidity is a good term because, I mean, a backbend is an extension, and some people, their spine is actually hyperextended, whereas other people, and again, even to generalize about age to say that we all go more into flexion is not quite accurate, because somebody with the scoliosis has both extension and flexion going on in the spine. So I think fluidity is a better way to approach it, because I don't want to overgeneralize and say everybody does too much of this or everybody does too much of that, because that's never really true. It's like, how do we maintain an even fluidity in the spine so that you're not hyperextended in one part of the spine and hyperflexed in another, and then just ending up moving in parts that start to get injured or painful from having done that. So it's, if we keep our eyes on the prize as far as what we're trying to achieve in the body, like that sense of overall fluidity, then we can really individualize our practice in looking at how well it works for us. And the energetics of it are important too, because backbends are certainly stimulating in different ways, often in ways that are surprising. to people, and it's worth looking at exactly what that stimulation is, and also the ways in which people can get overstimulated by doing backbending, and what the right degree of stimulation is. Because I remember running into friends that were teachers coming back from workshops in the past that emphasized a lot of backbending. They often shared with me that they were really jazzed and excited during the workshop, and left with this kind of euphoric high. And then after the weekend workshop, they crashed and were sick for a week because they were basically overstimulated by overdoing. And again, it felt great while they were doing it. And then afterwards, there was a kind of crash that came afterwards, sort of like a caffeine crash, only in yoga terms. And so finding the right balance of stimulation and relaxation, because everybody wants to get excited and jazzed, but just getting excited by your practice is doesn't always serve you. We're always looking for that kind of balance.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, great. Well, Doc, as always, it sounds like an awesome course, and I'm really excited that you're going to be addressing some of these, long-standing, I wouldn't say issues, but kind of deepening our
It's our
perspectives on the different.
evolution.
Huh?
It's our evolution in dealing with backbends.
Right, right,
I mean, evolution started with a backbend, and we're still working on it,
right.
coming up right.
Yeah, who would have known? All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Very
And have a
much.
great trip to Europe.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Okay.